Max Verstappen is not threatening to quit because he cannot handle losing. That is the fake story. The real story is much more dangerous. Because Formula One may have built a future so technical, so political, and so dependent on energy management that its greatest driver no longer wants to drive it. And now one rule change could decide everything. The current direction pushes the cars toward a 50-50 power split, half combustion, half electric. But Verstappen's condition is clear. Move toward 60-40 for 2027, give more control back to the driver, and the sport still has a chance. Refuse, delay it, or let the manufacturers fight it into the ground, and Max could walk away while he is still fast enough to win. That would not just destroy Red Bull's plans. It would shake the International Automobile Federation, explode the driver market, and force every fan to ask the question Formula One fears most. Has the sport become so advanced that it forgot what racing is supposed to feel like? Because if Verstappen quits, it will not be because he was beaten. It will be because Formula One changed into something he no longer believes is worth sacrificing his life for. And that makes this the most dangerous warning of the 2027 era. Subscribe to the channel. Max Verstappen is not threatening to quit because he cannot handle losing. That is the fake story. The real story is much more dangerous. Because Formula One may have built a future so technical, so political, and so dependent on energy management that its greatest driver no longer wants to drive it. And now one rule change could decide everything. The current direction pushes the cars toward a 50-50 power split, half combustion, half electric. But Verstappen's condition is clear. Move toward 60-40 for 2027, give more control back to the driver, and the sport still has a chance. Refuse, delay it, or let the manufacturers fight it into the ground, and Max could walk away while he is still fast enough to win. That would not just destroy Red Bull's plans. It would shake the International Automobile Federation, explode the driver market, and force every fan to ask the question Formula One fears most. Has the sport become so advanced that it forgot what racing is supposed to feel like? Because if Verstappen quits, it will not be because he was beaten. It will be because Formula One changed into something he no longer believes is worth sacrificing his life for. And that makes this the most dangerous warning of the 2027 era. Subscribe to the channel. At first, the paddock wanted to reduce this to a simple Red Bull problem. A car that is not fast enough. A champion who is not satisfied. A team that dominated for years, suddenly forced to fight instead of control. That explanation is neat. It is comfortable. It makes the story easy to understand. Red Bull built a difficult car, Verstappen became frustrated, and the rest of Formula One finally saw a weakness. But that version is incomplete. And this is where the danger begins. Because if Max Verstappen was only angry about Red Bull losing performance, this would be a normal crisis. A painful crisis, yes, but still normal. Teams lose their edge. Rivals catch up. Regulations shift. Development paths fail. Cars miss their targets. Formula One has seen that story many times. The solution would be obvious. Bring upgrades. Reduce weight. Find straight-line speed. Improve the rear stability. Open the operating window. Give Verstappen a car he can trust again. That would be hard, but Red Bull would know the battlefield. The real problem is that Verstappen is not only talking about Red Bull. He is talking about Formula One itself. And that changes everything. Because when a driver says the car is slow, the team can respond with development. But when a driver says the direction of the sport no longer feels right, the entire system is on trial. That is what makes this threat so dangerous. Verstappen is not simply asking for more lap time. He is questioning whether the next generation of Formula One cars will still give him the feeling that makes the sacrifice worth it. And that word, sacrifice, is not small. Formula One takes more from a driver than most people ever see. It takes weekends, but also weekdays. It takes flights, hotels, training, simulator work, media duties, sponsor events, technical briefings, pressure, criticism, and time away from family. It takes a normal life and breaks it into race calendars. A driver accepts that because the reward is something almost nobody on earth can feel. The feeling of being right on the limit. The feeling of braking later than instinct says you should. The feeling of controlling a machine that wants to punish every mistake. The feeling of speed becoming personal. For Verstappen, that feeling has always looked like oxygen. It is not just what he does. It is who he is when the visor comes down. So when he says Formula One may not be enjoyable under the current direction, that is not a casual complaint. That is a warning from the center of the cockpit. And it started before the worst results arrived. That is the detail many people missed. This was not born from one angry radio message. It was not created by one bad qualifying session. It was not invented because Red Bull suddenly looked beatable. Verstappen had already connected his future to the regulations before the crisis fully exploded. His contract may run until 2028, but his commitment was never only about a date on paper. Contracts can keep a name attached to a team. They cannot force a driver to love the car. They cannot force him to believe in the future. They cannot force him to spend years inside a machine that feels wrong. And this is where the 2027 engine debate becomes the heart of the story. The current direction pushes Formula One toward a 50-50 power split. Half combustion power, half electric power. On paper, that sounds balanced. It sounds modern. It sounds like the kind of future a global sport would want to advertise. But Formula One is not raced on paper. It is raced through instinct. A driver feels the car before he thinks about it. He feels the rear tires begin to move. He feels the throttle response. He feels the brake pedal. He feels whether the car is asking to be attacked or warning him to stay careful. Those tiny signals are invisible from the grandstand. But inside the cockpit, they are everything. And Verstappen's entire career has been built on reading those signals faster, sharper, and more aggressively than almost anyone else. He does not just drive at the limit. He lives there. Lap after lap, corner after corner, he turns trust into speed. He can make pressure feel cold. He can make risk feel controlled. He can force a race into his rhythm until everyone else starts making mistakes. But that only works when the car speaks clearly. If the car changes character because of electric energy deployment, if the power delivery depends too much on battery state, if the driver has to constantly think about saving and using energy at the right moment, the feeling changes. The driver is still racing. But he is also managing a system. And that is the part Verstappen appears to reject. Not technology itself. Formula One has always been technology. Red Bull's success was built on engineering obsession. Verstappen knows that better than anyone. The issue is not whether the cars should be advanced. The issue is whether advancement starts taking the driver away from the center of the experience. That is the line. And Verstappen has dragged that line into public view. Imagine sprinting as fast as you can, but your shoes keep changing how much grip they give you. Sometimes they push you forward. Sometimes they hold back. Sometimes they respond instantly. Sometimes they hesitate just enough to make your body question the next step. You can still run. You can still compete. But you are no longer free. That is the fear behind the 50-50 direction. Too much of the lap becomes about energy management. Too much of the driver's attention goes toward when power arrives, when it fades, and whether using it now will punish the next part of the lap. For some drivers, that may simply be part of the modern challenge. For Verstappen, it seems to attack the raw connection he values most. And that is why the proposed 60-40 change matters so much. 60% combustion. 40% electric. To many fans, that sounds like a small technical adjustment. Just numbers. Just percentages. Just another debate for engineers and rule makers. But inside this crisis, 60-40 is not small. It is the escape route. It means more direct power from the combustion side. Less dependence on extreme electric management. A car that may feel more responsive, more predictable, and more connected to the driver's right foot. Not old-fashioned. Not simple. Not a rejection of the future. A correction. A way of saying Formula One can evolve without making the driver feel secondary. That is why Verstappen's threat has become so powerful. He is not saying, make Red Bull dominant again. He is saying, make Formula One feel like Formula One. And that is far harder for the sport to dismiss. Because if he was only asking for dominance, rivals could laugh it off. They could say, of course he is unhappy now that he has to fight. They could call it pressure. They could call it politics. But when the argument becomes about the feeling of the car, the debate becomes much bigger. Fans understand feeling. They may not understand every part of an engine regulation, but they understand the idea of control. They understand when a sport becomes too complicated. They understand when the human part starts feeling smaller. People do not fall in love with Formula One because a battery deployment chart looks clever. They fall in love because a driver brakes later than seems possible. Because a car twitches and somehow stays alive. Because a champion takes a corner with commitment that makes the body tense, even from the sofa. That is the emotional contract. The car may be built by engineers, but the moment belongs to the driver. And Verstappen is warning that the future may weaken that moment. That is why this is not only Red Bull's crisis. It is also the International Automobile Federation's crisis. Because the governing body now has to decide whether the future rules are protecting the right things. It has to balance technology, sustainability, manufacturer investment, competitive fairness, and the raw driver feeling that makes Formula One different from everything else. That is almost impossible to do cleanly. If the rules move towards 60-40, some teams and manufacturers may feel punished. They may have invested heavily in the original 50-50 concept. They may believe they found an advantage. They may argue that changing direction now is unfair. And they have a serious point. Formula One cannot move the target every time a superstar complains. Stable rules matter. Manufacturers need confidence. Teams need to know that years of development will not be overturned because one driver is uncomfortable. But if the rules do not change, the sport faces a different kind of damage. It risks pushing Verstappen closer to the exit. And that consequence is not theoretical anymore. Because Verstappen does not sound like a driver who needs Formula One at any price. That is what makes his position so dangerous. Some drivers are tied to the paddock by identity. They need the noise, the cameras, the status, the feeling of being part of the Formula One machine. For them, leaving would feel like stepping out of their own life. Verstappen has always seemed different. He loves racing, but he does not seem addicted to the theater surrounding it. He has other projects, other interests, other ways to compete. He has already won what most drivers spend their childhood dreaming about and never touch. So when he says the future may not be worth it, the paddock has to take him seriously. Not because he will definitely leave, but because he might. And might is enough to change everything. Red Bull understands this better than anyone. The team can survive bad results. It can survive pressure. It can survive a difficult car. But building a future around a driver who is no longer emotionally convinced is something else entirely. A contract can put Verstappen in the seat. Belief keeps him there with full commitment. And right now, belief is being tested from two directions. Red Bull must convince him the present can be fixed. Formula One must convince him the future is still worth driving. If either side fails, the threat grows. That is why every weakness in the RB22 matters so much. The car's extra weight matters. The power gap to Mercedes matters. The rear instability over bumps matters. The narrow operating window matters. Because those problems do not exist in isolation. They add weight to the same emotional question. Why continue if the present is painful and the future looks wrong? A narrow operating window means the car only works properly when conditions are almost perfect. Track temperature, tire behavior, fuel load, wind, surface, balance, everything has to line up. If it does, the car can look alive. If it does not, the driver is fighting something unpredictable. Think of a door that opens only from one perfect angle. Push it correctly, and it moves. Push it slightly wrong, and it jams. Now imagine that door at 200 miles per hour. That is the kind of frustration a driver feels when the car will not give him a stable platform. And Verstappen's driving depends on trust. Trust that when he brakes late, the rear will hold. Trust that when he turns in, the car will rotate. Trust that when he opens the throttle, the response will come cleanly. Trust that when he commits, the car will meet him there. Without trust, a driver starts managing risk instead of attacking opportunity. And that is not Verstappen at his most dangerous. His strength is not caution. His strength is total commitment. So when the car takes that away, and the future regulations threaten to take even more of the natural feeling away, the issue becomes mental, not just technical. That is where Formula One should be worried. Because a technical problem can be analyzed. A mental disconnect is harder to reverse. Once a driver starts asking whether the whole experience is still worth the cost, every frustration becomes louder. Every delay feels heavier. Every race weekend becomes a test of patience. Every political argument becomes personal. And this is why the next decision around the engine rules carries so much weight. If Formula One approves the 60-40 direction for 2027, Verstappen gets a signal. The sport listened. The driver's role still matters. The future can be modern without feeling cold. The car can remain advanced without becoming a machine that the driver merely manages. That would not solve everything. Red Bull would still need to improve. The championship would still be difficult. Verstappen would still demand more. But the biggest question would have an answer. There would be a path to staying. If the change is delayed, blocked, or weakened, the story turns darker. Then every difficult race becomes part of a countdown. Every frustrated comment becomes a warning. Every meeting becomes suspicious. Every fan starts wondering whether the greatest driver of the era is preparing to walk away. That is the power of this crisis. It transforms a technical regulation into a human drama. And Formula One cannot escape it by saying the issue is complicated. Of course it is complicated. The sport is always complicated. But the emotional core is simple. Max Verstappen wants to feel that racing is still racing. If he does, Formula One still has him. If he does not, the sport may discover that even the biggest contracts, the biggest teams, and the biggest championships cannot hold a driver who no longer believes the car is worth the sacrifice.